So today we're going to talk about the book of Deuteronomy. Anomy. Deutero means two, and nomos is actually the Greek word for law. And so Deuteronomy is a Greek word that means the second giving of the law. And so they basically have taken what Moses was given in Exodus and Leviticus as the law, and they're retelling it. And if you actually look at it in the context of where it is, the people have wandered around now for their 2 years. Then they send the scouts into the land, and then they had 38 years because it had to be a total of 40 years for the wilderness wandering for the generation of that leadership group that came out of Egypt to all die off, except for Caleb and Joshua, because they are the two spies who went into the land that came back with a good report. And their report was, wow, this is indeed the land of milk and honey like God had said it was. And so they were the two that said, we can take this land with God's help. And so all of that was according to God's plan, and everything was going well. So Caleb and Joshua are the only two that got to go into the promised land out of that whole generation. Even Moses, because of his indiscretion at the second rock at Meribah, where he was told just to speak to the rock, was frustrated by all the stiff-necked Hebrews that he had wandering around, and he struck the rock with his staff instead of just speaking to it, and because he disobeyed God. And a lot of people, think, wow, that's such a terrible thing. But, God really took care of him. And number one, he was already 120 years old. So he had 40 years in Egypt. He had 40 years in the wilderness. Well, 40 years taking care of Jethro's sheep and living his life in the same region of Mount Sinai and the desert where they would wander. And then there was the next and last 40 years where he was leading the group of Israelites through the wilderness, and they kind of had to keep doing a little bit of a figure eight because they had to go where grassland was available for their livestock. And so, right at the end of 2 years, they sent the spies in, and then they had 38 years to wander, which was a total of 40 years that they were in the wilderness. And so at the end of that time, God allows Moses, and he takes him up on Mount, was it Nebo? My brain just stopped for a second. Anyway, up on the mountain, and he took Moses up there, and God and Moses stood there while they watched. Huh? Is it Moab? Yeah, Moab's a country. Anyway, while they watched the people cross the Jordan River being led by Joshua into the promised land. So he got to see from a very high vantage point everything as the people wandered. So in the book of Deuteronomy, we're going to find out several different things. And number one, this is, if you will, Moses preparing to die. God has already, was it Nebo? Yeah. God had already promised him that he would be able to see everything and see the promised land and see the people enter. So Moses didn't die until after they'd all crossed the Jordan River to take the land captive and hold onto what God had promised them. And as we'll talk about here in a little bit, there are a few, 2.5 of the tribes who decided they wanted to stay on the eastern side of the Jordan River because they saw some land that they liked and said, well, we'll just stay here, but we will fight with you in the fighting, and then we'll come back out and possess our land as well. And so we'll get to that in just a little bit. So they're commanded in chapter 1 to leave Mount Horeb and travel up to, if you will, basically the banks of the Jordan. And we can look at the book of Deuteronomy in all of its 30 odd chapters and was it 33 or 5, something like that, chapters, 34. And look at that and break it down into basically 4 different, if you will, sermons of Moses to the people. So look at Deuteronomy, yes, as the second giving of the law, but also Moses's final, if you will, opportunity to speak to all of the people as their leader. And so we're going to look at this kind of as 4 different sermons or times of teaching, if you will, of him and the people, okay? So kind of the question is, if you knew you were going to die in, say, a month, what would your bucket list look like? What would you really want to accomplish in those remaining days or weeks? I saw a movie not too long ago where a father knew he was going to die, and he sat down and he wrote letters to his daughter. He had one child, mother had already passed away, and he wrote letters to the daughter for her birthday. And so I think she went to live with her grandma or something, but anyway, and so he was able to give these letters in sealed envelopes and, you know, with her name and what birthday she would get them. So every year on her birthday till she was 21, she had a new letter from her father, encouraging her, challenging her, telling her stories, and that kind of thing. And so if you had X number of days left and you knew that, you know, your time was short, what would you do? All right. Deuteronomy, which is Moses talking to his people, you know, is one of those books where just, you know, we look at it and we hear the title and we think, oh, wow, the second giving of the law, right? But there's some really good things in here. And so the first couple of chapters are basically, if you will, documentary on what is to come. And then the importance of it really kicks in chapter 4 and following, especially when we get to chapter 6, and we'll look at that here in just a second, okay? Any questions at this point? By the way, all of your mics are unmuted at the moment, so be careful what you say. And you are, you have the capability of self-muting, and so, you know, if you need to cough or sneeze or laugh or do something, just go ahead and hit your mute button, you'll be fine. Other than that, we'll just carry on, okay? All right. Chapter 1 basically is the command, like I said, to leave Mount Horeb where they were and to head up. And they're going in this area where they're going to be by 2 mountains and kind of nestled together. Mount Nebo is one, and, you know, I had a hard enough time with that one, and I'll think of the other one here in just a minute. Well, they're leaving Horeb. It takes 11 days to go from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea and Mount Seir on the Mount Seir road. Anyway, remember, you're trying to move 2 million people through here, and they're heading through here. They're on the east side of the Jordan, where, by the way, Moab, and they've already gone through Ammon in the south, and these are all countries that were founded by the opposition, if you will, to Israel. So Israel is the product of which son of Isaac?
Jacob, Israel.
Okay, what's his real name before it got changed to Israel?
Jacob.
Dale and Tammy's last name.
Jacob.
Jacob, thank you, Sandy. Yeah, Hebrew pronunciation would be Yaakov. The B has a V sound at the end. So Yaakov, his name was changed to Israel from God himself, and God's in the business of changing names. He's already done that several times in the Old Testament. Moses is one whose name didn't change. Moses has been the same, but Moses was named after the fact that they pulled him out of the river, you know, and so he got his name by God's story anyway. So Esau was the older of the two sons of Isaac. Esau was, if you will, cheated out of his birthright by Jacob. Jacob became the one who got the blessing from God and became the father of the people of Israel. Esau went down and started, or his tribe ended up, if you will, becoming a nation, and God blessed and honored them. So you have Moab, and then his two daughters and their tribes had two others that they settled in regions. And so we end up with Ammon and Edom out of all of that. And so from Lot and his descendants, I meant Lot and his two daughters, and then you have Esau and his tribe, which was Moab, all right? And so from all of that, this is exactly where the people of Israel are coming up from Egypt through these countries and around to the eastern side of the Jordan River and then up in Moab, and they will cross over into the promised land, which normally is called Canaan, right? And where the Canaanites lived and broken down into a lot of different places, and the Philistines later and all that kind of good stuff. Anyway, so that east side, by the way, today is called the Golan Heights. And that is where Reuben and somebody and half of Manasseh decide to settle. And then the rest go over. And so in verse 19 of chapter 1, we have the spies being sent out from Kadesh Barnea. And remember, this is retelling because this is the second time we've heard all of this. So there's the appointment of leaders. Joshua's moving up through the ranks. He's now the top 5-star general or whatever you would call him. He's the head of the whole army. And later, as Moses gets ready for his death up on Mount Nebo, he hands the mantle over to Joshua, and Joshua becomes the leader of the people. As a matter of fact, Joshua begins very simply by saying Moses is dead. And so we know that there's this transition period from one leader to another. And guess what? There was no general election. There were no hanging chads. There's no, electoral college. It is God choosing who is going to be the leader of the people, right? So the first 4 or 5 chapters is all about what's going on in that area, about the wandering and everything. And then there's the defeat of a couple of kings, the king of Heshbon, and then the king of Bashan. And then we get to the division of the land in the second half of chapter 3. Moses is forbidden to cross the Jordan and go in, like I said. And then we get to chapter 4. And we come to these little phrases that are from here on out are going to really start popping up in great places, okay? So chapter 4, verse 1. Hear now, O Israel, the decrees and the laws that I am about to teach you. Follow them so that you may live and go in and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving to you. There are 2 things there. Number 1, God is giving the land to them. But number 2, they have to go and take possession of it. It's like that Christmas morning present, right? The child comes down and sees a present under the tree. The parent says, oh, that's for you. Just open it. And they tear the paper off and they look at it and they're like, wow, this is great. And then they push it aside and play with the box, right? How many times we've seen that, all right? The toy or present or whatever it is theirs for the taking, but they have to receive it and possess it. And guess what? That hasn't changed. That's the story of how we receive Christ as our Savior. It's a free gift. We have to receive it, though. We have to accept it for our own. And this is exactly what God said. He's been promising that for hundreds and hundreds of years to Abraham first, and then to all of his descendants. I am going to give you a land flowing with milk and honey. And sure enough, when the 12 spies go into the land, they come back and there's two men with a pole carrying a single cluster of grapes from that pole. It is huge. And by the way, it's a cluster. A cluster is singular, right? But the grapes are plural. And I want you to remember that because we're going to get to that here in just a minute. We're talking about a concept here in Deuteronomy about God. All right, and so verse 3, what you saw with your own eyes, the Lord did at Baal Peor. The Lord your God destroyed from whom among you everyone who followed Baal, but all of you who held fast to the Lord your God are still alive today. So God's promises is that he's going to protect and keep and preserve. God always has a remnant. And even like, back in the last time we were looking at all the minor prophets, and during that 70-year period of, the exile into Babylon, God protected and preserved his people. Yeah.
So up here where it says on verse 2, do not add to what I do.
Right.
Do not subtract from it.
Right.
So it's talking about the commandments.
The law.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lisa's asking a question about verse 2. Said, do not.
Read that.
Yeah, the Pharisees love that one, I'm sure. Verse 2 says, do not add to what I've commanded you, and don't subtract or take away from it, but keep the commands of the Lord your God that I give you. And so Lisa's question was, do you think the Pharisees read that verse? They loved adding to it.
They added so many, right?
Oh, yeah, hundreds. Okay, Scott, I know you said something. I couldn't hear you.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, they added so many. They were like 300 something.
There we go. Okay, there we go. Okay, say it again.
600. Wow.
He wasn't really saying anything.
His lips were moving. All right. By the way, God forbid idolatry again. What was he thinking? No idols, no false pagan worship. That starts in verse 15 and keeps on going. Also, they invent this thing, and it begins in chapter 4, verse 41, called cities of refuge. Did you know that Israel did not have any prisons? Their punishment generally was kind of swift and regulated, that if you committed a crime, they'd cut off your hand or they'd poke out your eye or do something else, but they had no prisons. And so God instituted in verse 41 of chapter 4, these cities of refuge. And so if you committed a crime or you murdered somebody, guess what? You could go to a city of refuge and live there and nobody could come and do anything to you, because it was a, if you will, we would use the word sanctuary. It is a place where they could go and not even have to stay inside a church the whole time, but they could go and live in this city of refuge and be free from, if you will, crime and punishment. Chapter 5 is a retelling of the 10 Commandments. And so from verse 1, Moses summoned all of Israel. Now I want you to picture this. So here is a multitude, 1 point something million. Now I know some have died off by this time, but others have been born. And so, we're around 2 million mark or so. Moses goes up the mountainside and all the people are down in the valley, and there's another mountain right over here. So Moses has everybody in basically, what we would call an amphitheater. And he has gone up on the mountain to talk down to. And so it was amazing. Moses did this. The Lord did this. Remember, several times on the Sea of Galilee, Jesus would get in a boat and he would go out into the water, and the water would transmit his voice back up the mountain where 5,000-10,000 people were sitting to listen to him teach. And so Moses is doing the same thing. And he comes to this point and he's like, all right, so here's the deal. Here are the 10 commandments, right? The Lord said, verse 6, I am the Lord your God. I brought you out of Egypt, out of your slavery, and you will have no other gods before me. Because when they were in Egypt, they got really good at learning about the other gods of Israel and Egypt. And Egypt had a god for everything. They had Ra, the sun god, and they had, we talked about those back in Exodus. And then, so have no other gods before me. Don't make any idols. And it goes on a little bit more and tells how you can. Don't fashion anything that you worship. And for us, it might be, television or something else, or our golf clubs or whatever. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. In Exodus says, don't take the Lord's name in vain. And here in this translation, New International Version, in Deuteronomy, it says, don't misuse the name, because God will hold you accountable for that, and you won't be guiltless in that. Just think how many people misuse and abuse the name of Jesus. They will be held accountable for that. And then verse 12, observe the Sabbath to keep it holy. Verse 16, then we get to the 6 that are about our relationship with people. Honor your father and mother. 17, you shall not commit murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife and or anything that you desire from their household. Verse 22, these are the commandments that the Lord proclaimed in a loud voice to your whole assembly there on the mountain, from which came out of the fire and the cloud and the deep darkness. And he added nothing more. And then he wrote them down on 2 stone tablets and gave them to me. So Moses is reminding the people that he spent time up on Mount Sinai with God, and God hand wrote according to Charlton Heston version, God laser etched it. And all you could see was Charlton Heston over there as Moses hiding while the laser was etching out and the stone tablets, with the 10 commandments on them. Verse 23, when you heard the voice out of the darkness while the mountain was ablaze with fire, all of the leading men of your tribes and your elders came to me, and they said, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and his majesty, and we have heard his voice from the fire. And today we have seen that a man can live even if God speaks with him. By the way, only Moses. God did not have that kind of relationship with anybody else. Not Aaron the high priest, no one. Moses and Moses alone was the only one who could go into the presence of God and sit and talk with him. And it was a very, very special thing. And then we get to chapter 6, which is one of the highlights of Hebrew life and culture. And verses 4 and 5 stand out. But let's begin with verse 1. These are the commands, the decrees, and the laws of your Lord God directed to me as I observed the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, that your children and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live, by keeping all of his decrees and his commands. Okay. Verse 3, hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey, that it may go well with you, and that you may increase greatly in a land flowing milk and honey. And then we get to verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. These are the commandments that I will give to you today, and are to be upon your hearts, and impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you're walking around. And when you lie down at night, let it be the first thing you think of when you get up in the morning. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them to your forehead. And a good Orthodox Jew will have a little box on a string, or our day elastic band, that they would put. And in that box, they have the Shema written and inscribed and placed there, so that they have it there on their heads. talk about it, tie it as symbols. Anyway, verse 4. All right, we're going back. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Okay, remember the cluster of grapes? All right, we got to talk about the cluster of grapes. So I've got to go here for a second, and then there, and then here, and then, oh, my button is hidden.
Don't lose that.
There we go. All right. So those of you on video, can you see Deuteronomy?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So there is a bridge between the first 4 and the last 7, right? So the first 4, we're talking about going outside the land, and the next 7 are inside the land. Hang on a second. Clicker's not working. Okay, there we go. All right. The Shema is, if you will, the great commandment, okay? And when I say the bridge between the two, right, we have all of the law that has preceded and then what is to come, and they carry it with them. And so now the Shema, or Shema, as a good Jew would say, is the great commandment, right? And so there are more quotes by Jesus from Deuteronomy than any other book in the Bible or in the Old Testament. Jesus used Deuteronomy to communicate to the people. Now, Jesus, when he was taking the Shema and talking about it, it says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Remember I talked about the cluster of grapes? We're going to get to the plurality of oneness here in just a second, okay? But also we have the Song of Moses here, and then we have the death of Moses coming up. And Moses' bones, if you will, or his body, were fought over between Michael the archangel and Satan, who contended together. There's a couple of verses in the book of Jude in the New Testament talk about that. And a lot of people believe that it's Moses who is one who will appear in he was in the transfiguration with Elijah, but also a lot of people believe that he'll be one of the 2 witnesses. I have other friends who believe that he won't be because he died, and that the only 2 witnesses who never died were who? What 2 characters in the Old Testament never died? Enoch was one. He lived 365 years and was not. And Elijah went up in a chariot of fire after he had passed the mantle to Elisha. Right. So a lot of people believe that the 2 witnesses in Revelation 11 will be Enoch and Elijah, because they never had a physical death. A lot of people believe that it'll be Moses, because Moses is seen as the first great prophet and leader of the people, who sets up everything and was at the transfiguration. And so a lot of people think that the transfiguration characters will be the same too as the 2 witnesses in Revelation 11. But let's talk about the Shema, all right? And you can say Shema or whatever, but usually in Hebrew, the emphasis goes up on the last syllable. So the Shema, all right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. One Lord, okay? We know that from Genesis, the very beginning of Genesis as well. And here, this will be what you, right? And shall be the Lord thy God with all of thy heart. You shall love him with all your heart and soul and strength. What did Jesus add, by the way, in the New Testament?
Mind.
What'd you say?
Mind.
Mind, that's right. Jesus added mind. It is not a part of the Shema, but he did add that. He said, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength, and with all of your mind, right? So to Jesus, there's a different, if you will, section or holding out of those things. We take the 3 pieces and we can put those into, physical, spiritual, and, our emotional categories, right? All of your heart, right, is kind of what we think about when we talk about our soul. Our physical is with all of our might or our strength, and our spiritual, we have our soul, which is the sum kinetic whole of everything that we are. And these words which I have commanded thee this day shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently, right? Write them, teach them, talk about them, repeat them, recite them when you're coming in, when you're going out, when you lay down at night, when you're getting up in the morning. And you'll write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. So not only do they keep the word, in a little box on their head, as you come in. What's the significance of the doorpost, by the way?
That's
Yeah. Every time you come in and go out of the doorpost, you're walking under that blessing of who God is. And it's also a great way to remember the Passover and what God had separated them out to do, right? So here, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, okay? The word here for the Lord is echad, and it's a compound unity, right? So the cluster of grapes motif. It's a cluster, and yet there are a lot of grapes. So here we go back to that triune God concept. We have Father, Son, and Spirit, and yet in all of our goings and comings, right, what do we have? Well, we have the plurality of oneness, okay? Now, this stands apart from the other Hebrew word, which is yachid, and it is never used of Yahweh. It is never used of the Lord. It is a plural absolute unity, and a singular absolute unity, and is never used of the Lord, but Yahweh, Lord, and translated or used as echad, appears 3 times in the Shema, okay? So, all right, so here's some dangers of compromise. Like I said, Reuben and Gad was one I couldn't remember, and half of the tribe of Manasseh chose land east of the Jordan River, right? When they're settling out the land and dividing it, they wanted to stay east of the Jordan. The compromise, as Lot had done, remember Lot and Abraham standing on the mountain, and Abraham said, which way do you want to go? Lot chose the fertile land in the valley down between 2 places called Sodom and Gomorrah. We find out later on that that's not a really good choice, but yet he went there because it looked like there was a lot of pasture land for his cattle and oxen and sheep and everything. But it was a compromise of sight. And so here again, we have a petition of Gad and Reuben and half of the tribe of Manasseh. Remember, Manasseh is one of the sons of Joseph. The other one is Ephraim. So half of the tribe of Manasseh wanted to stay on the eastern side of the Jordan. In the New Testament, we call it the Transjordan, because they would cross the Jordan to go up so they wouldn't have to go through Samaria to come back in across the Jordan again, up near Galilee and below the Sea of Galilee, right? So after participating in the conquest, the fighting men came back to the region of what we call now today the Golan Heights, and that's where they lived. So they told Moses they want to stay. They would go, all of the fighting men would go and fight with the people to, seize and gain the promised land like God had instructed them. And then they would return to their families on the eastern side of the Jordan River. This region was, number one, the first to fall to idolatry. Got that? So here is land that they're choosing by the sight of it and not God's choice for them. They're choosing their own land and not what God wanted them to have. And they become the first to fall to idolatry. They become the first to go into captivity. And it remains still vulnerable buffer zone even today. The Golan Heights still plays as one of those major areas in the land quote unquote, of the ancient Near East and Israel that everything does as well. So, all right, let me get back to my sign there. All right. So after we go through all of that, we're out of Moses's first sermon, if you will. The second sermon, the first sermon is basically 1 through 4. The second sermon was 5 through about 14 or 15. And then there is a summary again in chapter 26. Okay. So all of that is kind of Moses's first 2 sermons, if you will. And then when we get out of Moses reminding the people and telling the people, then we get way on up to chapter 26. And Moses' second sermon concludes with an oath of allegiance by both God and the people. So all of that, you've got rules and laws for the leaders, prophet like Moses, rules for witnesses and war and miscellaneous. And so it's a retelling of the law to remind the people, number one, who they are, who they belong to, and what is going on and transpiring, okay? All right, then we get out of that, and then we're in chapter 27, and that part of the law has been reviewed and everything. And now we start to talk about the written law. So turn to chapter 27, and would somebody read verses 2 through 4? We'll see if we can hear everybody.
Now Moses, with the elders of Israel, commanded the people, saying, keep all the commandments which I command you today. And it shall be on the day when you cross over the Jordan to the land of which the Lord your God is giving you, that you shall set up for yourselves large stones and whitewash them with lime. You shall write on them all the words of the law when you have crossed over, that you may enter the land which the Lord your God is giving you, a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord God of your fathers promised you. Therefore it shall be, when you have crossed over the Jordan, that on Mount Ebal you shall set up these stones which I command you today, and you shall whitewash them with lime.
Okay, so what are they instructed to do? They take 2 standing stones, if you will, big, tall rocks, and not just leave the, if you will, granite face there, but they're to plaster over them and whitewash them so that they will be seen and the sun will be reflecting off of them. And they're to write, in Hebrew, of course, the words of God, the law of the people. Guess what it's going to start with? The Big Ten, right? God gave them, the 10 Commandments on 2 stone tablets. And so now God's instructing them to raise 2 stones and to treat them and put a, if you will, a facade on them so that a whitewashed face with a smooth, plaster surface on it, they can write the law. It was a way to keep God's requirement constantly before the people. Even when the stones were out of sight, they would still stand in their memory. It's like if you look at a light bulb too long and then you close your eyes, what do you see? You see a big glowing globe, or if you're looking at fluorescent lights, a big long rectangle, right? Number one, don't do that. It's not good for your eyes. Number two, the whiteness of the stone and the black etching on it. There's an old kind of silhouette picture of Jesus that's on a white background and then just a black, if you will, etching, and it's a sideways profile of his head. But when you first look at it, it doesn't look like Jesus. But when you stare at it for 30 seconds and then close your eyes, the 2 colors place, right? And so all the white becomes dark and what was black becomes white and comes towards you. And you see clearly the face of Jesus staring at you. It's kind of fun. It's a good optical illusion. I used to use it in class for people to, start to think out of their box a little bit. Yeah, that's it, Michelle.
Yeah, I've seen that.
Oh, whoops, there it went.
No way.
Sorry.
You moved over.
There's somebody's tree in somebody's backyard, and yeah, I don't know. Anyway, you got to click. You know, you didn't get it for 30 seconds. Sorry about that. So, all right, and yeah, I'll mess it up again. So anyway, so when you look at that for 30 seconds and then you shut your eyes, it reverses, and so the black becomes white and the face of Jesus becomes black. I had it backwards, but anyway. When the law is heard, sinful people recognize that they have a problem and they can't solve it themselves. Is that true today?
Yep.
Let me say it again. When the law is heard, God's commands, when they are heard, sinful people recognize they have a problem that they cannot solve themselves. Okay. We have two problems with that today. Number one, nobody wants to hear what is right because we live in an age of relativity. What is right for me doesn't necessarily have to be right for you. And so Christians are called intolerant because we don't want everybody to have the freedom of self-expression and choosing what is right and wrong for themselves. So doing drugs and abusing drugs may be right for you, but it's not right for you. And the extreme of that is what? Taking advantage of other people or abusing them or murder even might be right for me in my psychosis, but it's not right for you. So somewhere in there has to be a code, or in the Old Testament, it's called commandments, to help us understand what is right and what is wrong. So the big 10 commandments, the first 4 about our relationship with God, the other 6 are about taking care of our relationships with other people, right? So we get to chapter 28. So I have Mount Nebo on one side, Mount Ebal right next to it. And this is where Moses is preaching down to the people, if you will. And then he gets to chapter 28. And this is the blessings for being obedient. Look at verse 3. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. It doesn't matter if you're city mouse or country mouse. If you follow the demands, the decrees of God, God will bless you. Look at verses 1 through 3. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all of his commands that I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all of the nations of the earth. Who are God's chosen people? What is the promise for the nation of Israel? Here. You wonder why the Jews still today, and this is going to sound like a stereotype and maybe even prejudice. No, I'm glad for it. But the Jews have been given wisdom and special blessing by God because they are his chosen people. We are not. We're grafted in. We do become joint heirs with Jesus, but guess what? We're not the original claim to be the people of God. And God has a special purpose for Israel. Read Romans 11 if you don't think so. God is not finished with them yet. All right. Look at verse 2. All of the blessings will come upon you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. Remember Sunday we talked about Second Chronicles 7:14. It's one of those great if-then things. If my people, then will I. Here's another one. If you follow all of my commands, then will I, verse 3, bless your socks off. Give you the fruit of your womb will be blessed, and the crops of your land and your livestock. Your baskets will be full, and your kneading trough will be blessed. Everything you do, making bread, will be blessed. Having children will be blessed. Having livestock will be blessed. Why? You're following the decrees of the Lord. And this is how God has set apart his people. And now as they're getting ready to move into the promised land, they have to be obedient because that is what God sets them up. Guess what? They don't.
Never learned.
Look at verse 15. Yeah. Verse 15. However, if you don't obey the Lord and you don't carefully follow his commands and his decrees that I'm giving you today, all of these curses will come upon you and overtake you. And then it goes on for quite a while, verse after verse. The Lord will drive you and the king out of the nation. The Lord will do this. You will have suffering from your enemies. You will, So God's going to bless you, bless your socks off. He's going to bless the dough that you're needing to make bread. He's going to bless your children. He's going to bless your livestock if you obey him. But then you get to the rest of the chapter, verse 15 and following, and guess what? God can also curse you if you don't obey. That's why the Shema is so important, because it says what? Yeah, love the Lord with all of your, not a part of your. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? Well, take mind out. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. All, that's the key word, right? Verse 31, Joshua succeeds Moses. Moses knows that he is not going to cross the river, and now the time for Joshua to take over is coming. And so Moses is going to take the mantle of leadership and place it onto Joshua. Here's a really cool thing, because Moses tells Joshua to be strong and be courageous and to trust in the Lord. And when you get to chapter 1 of Joshua, and this is, they just crossed the Jordan River. They're coming into the promised land. This is before the Battle of Jericho. It's before they start to take possession of anything. God himself says to Joshua several times, it's 4 or 5 times in the first chapter of Joshua, Joshua, be bold and courageous. Joshua, be courageous. Joshua, and he just tells Joshua the same thing that Moses did over and over and over again, to be strong and courageous. If you want to look at it, it is verse 23 of chapter 31, where Moses, and he said to Joshua, be strong and courageous, for you will bring the Israelites into the land that God has promised them. And I promised them with an oath that I would be there with you, and I'm going to be watching you. By the way, do you realize that there are only 3 people in the Bible that didn't have parents? Adam and Eve, God created them in the garden, right? And Joshua, the son of Nun. It's spelled N-U-N. They misspelled it somehow. But we know that Catholic nuns can't have children either, because that would mean something else. But anyway. So that's, by the way, in chapter 31 and also in Joshua chapter 1. So, often when you see Joshua's name. Oh, yeah, it's verse 44 of chapter 32. So Moses came with Joshua, son of Nun, and spoke all these words. And Moses finished reciting all these words to Israel, and he said to them, take to heart everything that I have declared to you this day, so that you may command your children to obey all of the words of this law. So it wasn't enough that they heard the blessings and the law again. The instruction in the Shema was, hear, O Israel, which includes everybody. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, right? The Lord your God is one Lord. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and soul and strength. And oh, by the way, teach your children well. Teach them how to do that. Then chapter 34 is the death of Moses. I've always had a question. Who wrote chapter 34? Well, we'll find out. I think God wrote it. I don't know. Maybe so, yeah. Buck said God wrote the whole Bible, so you can't argue with that, I guess. But anyway, then Moses climbed up Mount Nebo to the plains, from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah and across from Jericho. He could see everything, in other words. And there the Lord showed him the whole land from Dan, which is way north of the Sea of Galilee. Remember in the scripture, it'll say from Dan to Beersheba. Beersheba is the southernmost city of Judah, right before you go into the Negev desert. Dan is the northernmost city, not the tribe of Dan, but the city of Dan, the northernmost city in the land of Israel when it's the, oops, I got to get my hands closer together, when it's the unified land of Israel, from Dan to Gilead, right? From all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, his vantage point is like being in a helicopter. He's up on the mountain and he can look over the Jordan River into the valley and he can see everything in the parade route from the southernmost part of Israel to the northernmost part of Israel. Probably more like that. So actually Israel always, they kind of go east and west more than anyway. And now verse 9. Oh, well, let's go to verse 5. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He, God, buried him in Moab in the valley opposite of Beth Peor. But it's to this day, no one knows where his grave is. And Moses was 120 years old when he died, and yet his eyes had not grown weak, nor his strength gone. He was still in good shape for 120 years old. God had kept him and preserved him. And the Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. And then when the time of weeping and mourning was over, Joshua shows up. And Joshua, verse 9, the son of Nun was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the passing of the mantle from Moses to Joshua included the gift of the Spirit of God. And the Israelites listened to him, and they did as the Lord commanded through Moses. Verse 10, and since then no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And think about that the Lord knew face to face. Well, no, that was the Shekinah glory of God. But when God in the person of Jesus would come down to the planet and spend time with Moses, they would sit in two chairs and look at each other and talk, right? Now, this is not the presence of God who's on the throne in heaven. This is the incarnate Jesus come to earth again. And every time he came down, he had a face-to-face confab with Moses, and no one else since then ever did. So Moses was that one, right? And who did all the miracles and the marvelous signs and wonders in Egypt to Pharaoh and to all of his officials and the whole land. Verse 12, for no one has ever known the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel to that point. There would be one who would come a few thousand years later and was born in a little town named Bethlehem. And that guy, by the way, whose name is Yeshua, he had more power than Moses had in all of his bones and body, because he is the Son of God who was filled with the power of the Spirit of God. And as Hebrews says, it was for joy of what was set before him that he endured the cross. Jesus knew the end, and that helped him to endure everything that we just set apart and worshiped this coming last weekend and Good Friday and Sunday. So, all right, that's sort of the book of Deuteronomy, leaving out a lot of just revisiting some of the law, but hitting the highlights and making our way through it and sticking really with chapter 6 and 31 through 34 there at the end. And then you go to the book of Jude and you discover that Satan was arguing, or as it says, contending with Michael the archangel over the body of Moses. And according to chapter 34, nobody knows actually where he's buried. And so Michael probably couldn't even surrender that information if he wanted to. So anyway, a lot of key things that are in the New Testament, revealing the Old Testament, and the Old Testament, setting up everything that is to come in the New Testament. And without the Old Testament, the New Testament doesn't make any sense at all. Without the Old Testament, we wouldn't have the sermons of Peter and Paul. Or like we said today, Jesus quoted Deuteronomy more than anything else. And so without the Old Testament, and especially the 5 books of law, which we just finished, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, we wouldn't have, the context of why Jesus came and what he was about. So if our good friend Hal was here, he'd say, yeah, but remember, we got to look at it from the Hebrews' eyes because they're seeing it and hearing it for the very first time. We have the advantage, or maybe even the disadvantage, of being able to look at it from here back through the cross to then. And so now we're at the Jordan River, and next we'll look at the book of Joshua, and then Judges and Ruth, and we'll just keep on moving. So any questions for today?
It's hard to imagine 2 million people wandering through a land.
I know.
Yeah.
And what about the people that were already there? I mean, it's mind-boggling.
And if you did social distancing with 2 million,
Oh, good grief.